The ship shook violently, alarms blaring from every corner of the bridge. Glotz clung to his station with both sets of arms, his mandibles clamped shut in frustration. Red lights flashed, casting everything in an ominous glow as the temperature spiked a few degrees. The rest of the crew scrambled about in a chaotic mess that would have sent a lesser Varthik into cardiac arrest. In the middle of it all stood Kevin, human, unfazed, with the calm serenity of someone who either didn't understand the gravity of the situation or flat out refused to acknowledge it. He took another sip from his steaming cup of coffee, blinking lazily at the frantic scene unfolding before him. How is he so calm? Glotz thought, a vein in his upper antenna twitching uncontrollably. Kevin seemed to finally notice the panic around him, his eyebrows lifting with casual curiosity. He pulled one of the many earbuds out of his ear and turned to Glotz. "Hey, man, is it supposed to be this hot in here?" Kevin asked, gesturing around at the flashing lights. "Because I swear it feels like a sauna." Glotz's eyes narrowed, feeling his first pair of fists tighten involuntarily. His secondary arms were busy typing furiously on his data tablet, trying to pinpoint what the malfunction was. The ship's systems were running diagnostics on the cooling systems, but nothing was making sense. This is not a sauna!" Glotz hissed. "We are in the middle of a ship-wide system failure. If I don't correct this in the next 3 minutes, we will all be boiled alive." Kevin took another sip of coffee, pausing to look contemplative. That's not great. You sure you've checked all the systems? Could be something you missed." Glotz shot him a look that, in Varthik culture, could melt glass. He turned back to the data screen, ignoring the beads of sweat forming on his brow. Behind him, the alien crew stumbled over each other, trying to reroute power to the cooling units. Kevin watched them for a few more seconds, his expression growing slightly more serious. He set his coffee cup down, sighed and muttered, "All right, I've had enough of this." He walked over to a maintenance panel, grabbing a heavy-duty hammer from the tool rack. The crew paused, staring in confusion as Kevin approached one of the cooling pipes, which was vibrating violently. "Kevin, what are you?" Glotz began, but before he could finish, Kevin swung the hammer in one smooth motion, striking the pipe with a loud clang. There was a moment of silence, followed by the sound of something unclogging within the system. The pipe shuddered, then settled, and almost immediately, the temperature began to drop. The alarms faded, the lights dimmed to a tolerable level, and the ship hummed back to life. Kevin turned back to Glotz, picking up his coffee cup with a satisfied nod. "Sometimes you just gotta hit it. Good old human troubleshooting." Glotz blinked, staring at the human. His tablet pinged, 1 minute left before total meltdown. He couldn't decide what was more infuriating, the fact that they had been seconds from disaster, or the fact that Kevin had fixed it with a hammer. The rest of the crew, slumped and exhausted, stared wide-eyed at Kevin. None of them dared to speak. "I can't," Glotz muttered to himself. "I can't." Kevin took another sip, flashing Glotz a thumbs up. "Crisis averted, huh? Nice work, buddy." Glotz felt something inside him snap. It was small at first, like a mental hairline fracture, but it spread quickly, a chasm of repressed rage, disbelief, and the sudden realization that his species, for all its superior intelligence, had no idea how to handle a human. That was when the decision was made. A manual. He needed a manual. Not just for him, but for every sentient being in the galaxy who would ever come into contact with this chaotic species. Glotz sat down at his station, the ship system still stabilizing, and opened a new file on his datapad. His mandibles clicked thoughtfully as he began typing. "The Human Manual, a practical guide to managing Earthlings on intergalactic vessels." The Varthik scientist paused, looking over his first draft. It was too. No, he needed something real, something that conveyed the absolute madness of his situation. He closed the file and restarted, this time in first person. "If you're reading this, it means you've survived at least 1 week with a human. Congratulations. This is no small feat. Now, before we dive into the particulars, let me make one thing clear. Humans are, by far, the most bizarre, chaotic species you will ever encounter in the galaxy. You will be confused, you will be frustrated, and at some point, you will question why you even allowed a human aboard your ship. This manual aims to provide at least a fraction of the guidance necessary for maintaining sanity while in their company. Glotz paused, reading over the first lines of his new masterpiece. That would do. He could feel his frustration pouring onto the digital page, and frankly, it was therapeutic. Perhaps this manual would not only save future alien commanders from the agony of dealing with humans, it might also save him. He turned to his left, where Kevin was sprawled across the navigator's chair, lazily clicking through more of his so-called playlist. With a sigh, Glotz resumed typing. Chapter 1, Crazy Solutions. Humans have an inexplicable tendency to solve problems in ways that no logical being would ever consider. Their solutions are often crude, borderline reckless, and yet somehow effective. The following examples should serve as both a warning and a guide for what to expect when dealing with a human in crisis. The hammer incident was not an isolated event. There had been several other similar situations aboard Kraksog's Wisdom that baffled Glotz to his core. Take the time when a critical door malfunctioned, trapping a group of crew members in the cargo bay. The Varthic engineers were frantically attempting to reroute the power systems to get the door open. Kevin had walked in, assessed the situation, and casually picked up a crowbar. Without a word, he jammed it into the gap between the door and its frame, leveraging it with surprising ease until the door popped open with a screech. Sometimes you just got to use a little elbow grease, Kevin had said, flashing a grin, while the crew members stared at him in bewilderment. The engineers had spent hours on their detailed schematics, yet Kevin solved the problem with brute force in a matter of seconds. Then there was the time the ship's gravity control started fluctuating. The Varthic were growing desperate, attempting to fine-tune the delicate machinery to stabilize it. Kevin, evidently tired of floating and slamming into walls, grabbed a roll of duct tape and headed straight for the control panel. Can't be that different from fixing a bike back home, he muttered. He wrapped several layers of tape around a suspiciously loose-looking wire. To Glotz's utter disbelief, the gravity stabilized immediately, bringing everyone safely back to the floor. And who could forget the incident involving the comm system? The ship's long-range communications had mysteriously failed, and the crew was at their wits' end, trying to recalibrate the intricate array of transmitters. Kevin, who had been watching quietly, finally rolled his eyes, pulled out a piece of metal wire, and fashioned an impromptu antenna. He stuck it onto the panel with chewing gum, and miraculously the signal returned at full strength. Sometimes you just need a little DIY, Kevin said, chewing thoughtfully on another piece of gum while the Varthic engineers gawked in open-mouthed astonishment. There was also the time the environmental filtration system started malfunctioning, filling the air with a noxious smell that sent most of the crew into a coughing fit. Human air fresheners were strictly forbidden aboard the ship, as their strong scents could overstimulate or even incapacitate certain alien species. Yet Kevin wandered into the room with a bottle of household air freshener he had somehow smuggled aboard. He sprayed it liberally around the room, and while it didn't fix the actual problem, it made the atmosphere bearable until the Varthic could repair the filter. Against all regulations, Kevin's rule-breaking once again saved the day. "Lemon fresh," Kevin had announced proudly, as if he'd just saved the ship from a catastrophic disaster. Glotz was sure there had to be a better way, but Kevin's methods, simplistic, seemingly crude, had a strange, undeniable charm. Perhaps it was the efficiency of skipping a dozen steps that made the human's approach so unique. The unpredictability of his solutions kept everyone on their toes. One moment they were on the verge of catastrophe, the next Kevin had somehow fixed everything with the tools of a primitive handyman. Glotz sighed as he typed the summary for this chapter. Human solutions may defy logic, science, and all sense of self-preservation, but they work. Be prepared for the unexpected. And if you see a human with a hammer, crowbar, duct tape, or chewing gum, brace yourself for a strange but effective fix. Chapter 2. Monstrous Anatomy. Humans are often described as death worlders by many species in the galaxy. This is not an exaggeration. Their bodies are adapted to survive in an environment that would be considered extraordinarily hostile by most galactic standards. They possess an unsettling level of resilience, strength, and adaptability that can be both impressive and terrifying. Here are some examples. It had taken Glotz a while to get used to the human penchant for shrugging off injuries. There was the time Kevin had accidentally cut his hand while working on a malfunctioning console. Glotz had immediately sounded the alarm, expecting Kevin to need immediate medical attention. Instead, Kevin had just glanced at the wound, shrugged, and wrapped it with a piece of cloth he tore from his own uniform. "It's just a scratch," Kevin had said, even as a small but steady stream of blood trickled from his hand. He then proceeded to finish the repair job before even considering visiting the medical bay. The Varthic medic on duty had fainted, her antennae twitching in shock. Another incident, during a mission to a frozen tundra-like moon, the crew had to trek through knee-deep snow with temperatures far below freezing. The Varthic crew were shivering uncontrollably, their exoskeletons not designed for such intense cold. Kevin, on the other hand, seemed completely unfazed, wearing what looked like a light jacket. At one point, he even fashioned a sled out of some loose metal panels to carry one of the crew members who had collapsed from the cold. "Ever been to Minnesota in winter?" Kevin had quipped, his breath visible in the icy air. "This is nothing." The Varthic couldn't comprehend it. How could a creature from such an unforgiving planet treat this extreme cold like it was just a mild inconvenience? Then there was Kevin's remarkable resistance to toxins. Glotz remembered the time Kevin had accidentally ingested a beverage meant for the Gorlak, a species known for their extreme tolerance to acidic substances. The crew had panicked, expecting Kevin to collapse, convulse, or worse. Instead, Kevin grimaced, set the cup down, and muttered, "Tastes like stale Mountain Dew, blear!" before chugging a gallon of water and carrying on with his day. On another occasion, Kevin had been dealing with a clogged waste disposal unit that had caused the mess hall to flood with a horrendous smell. The Varthic engineers had donned full hazmat suits, attempting to extract the blockage with long, specialized tools. Kevin watched them struggle for a while, shook his head, and then disappeared. Moments later, he returned, wearing swim goggles and holding a plunger. The Varthic crew looked on in horror as Kevin waded straight into the mess, positioned the plunger over the disposal opening, and gave it a few firm pumps. With a gurgle and a loud swoosh, the clog cleared and the smell began to dissipate. Kevin grinned and raised the plunger like a trophy. "Sometimes you just got to get your hands dirty," he said cheerfully, while the crew stared, utterly bewildered. Glotz couldn't decide whether to be impressed or horrified. It had worked, but the sheer disregard for procedure made his mandibles ache. Even Kevin's immune system seemed to defy reason. When a mysterious virus swept through the crew, incapacitating half the Varthic, Kevin barely seemed to notice. He had a mild headache and a slightly runny nose for a day or two, but otherwise continued his duties as usual. The ship's medic was incredulous, muttering that the virus should have knocked Kevin out for at least a week. Kevin just shrugged and said, "Must be all the vitamin C in those oranges I've been eating." Human anatomy is, quite frankly, a miracle of durability. They heal quickly, possess strength disproportionate to their size, and endure conditions that would incapacitate most species. Treat them with caution, as what they consider mild discomfort could be a near-death experience for others. Glotz leaned back, rubbing his temples. Writing this manual was both cathartic and exhausting. Every time he thought he had a grasp on what made humans tick, Kevin would do something to shatter that understanding completely. He looked over at Kevin, who was currently arm-wrestling Zlag for fun, his laughter echoing through the ship. Glotz sighed and resumed typing. The galaxy had to know. Humans were not to be underestimated. Glotz stared at the screen, rubbing his eyes in disbelief. His manual was far from complete, but the basics were there, and if nothing else, it would serve as a warning to future crews who might consider accepting a human on board. But, just as he leaned back to take a much-needed break, Kevin popped up behind him, grinning. "What you working on?" Glotz nearly jumped out of his seat. The manual," Kevin laughed. A manual, huh? I hope you're putting in all the good stuff. Glotz groaned. There is nothing good about this. Kevin clapped him on the shoulder, oblivious to the Varthic's seething frustration. Oh, come on, Glotzy! You know you love having me around. Besides, without me, this ship would be so boring. Glotz closed his eyes, imagining what it would be like to have one day of peace. Just one. Sure, Kevin, he muttered, knowing it was a lie. Sure. As Kevin wandered off to find more coffee or to cause some new disaster, Glotz resumed typing. Final note. If you ever find yourself on Earth, don't. Just don't.
Thank you for watching. Like, share and subscribe for more original content. New chapters and standalone stories uploaded weekly.